So welcome to another episode of Menable Matters with me, Steve Whitten. Now, absolutely delighted that Professional Speaking Association royalty is joining me on the podcast today. She is an inclusive leadership specialist and an absolute star keynote speaker. So Jackie Handy, welcome to Menable Matters. How are you?
I'm great, Stephen. Yeah, thank you. I'm slightly intimidated by that intro about being royalty of some sort. But yeah, I'm really good. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
No, thank you so much for joining me. So we are recording this podcast bang in the middle of Pride 2022, Pride Month. And so that will give us a little bit of a hint about some of the things that we might come on to talk about. But in good old Menable Matters fashion, if I could ask you, Jackie, to introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about who you are, where you're from, and what you do. And if you want to make that last about 40 minutes, that'd be brilliant.
It's like Blind Date on steroids, isn't it? Do you remember that? You know,
Just
what's
a bit,
your name?
yeah.
Where'd you come from? Yeah. Well, obviously, I'm Jackie Handy, and I am an inclusive leadership specialist. Now, what does that encompass? I hear you ask. So
what does that encompass, Jackie?
I am a professional speaker.
Yep.
Yes, and yes, I am a fellow member of the Professional Speaking Association, as you mentioned, and their diversity, equity, and inclusion director on the board as well, which is a voluntary post I undertook last year.
Yeah.
I also design and deliver training workshops around the topics of leadership and diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I either do those as separate entities, or indeed my preference is always to merge those two things together because they're equally important and should go, I believe, in the same stream. Yeah. What else do I do? I consult with some organizations. So I work globally with businesses, and that might be in person or, of course, latterly, more recent years, it's been very, very much virtual. But I work with global organizations, and I work with them really to help them on that inclusion journey. And that is aimed typically at their sort of middle management level teams. I created, as you can see, strategic product placement on the back shelf. My little book of belonging, which is your weekly guide to inclusive habits. So I created that little desktop flip book in 2020 because, you know, hey, we were in lockdown. I thought, oh, create a book. And that's me, really. I'm extremely passionate about the subject of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how really it can help us just from a humanity perspective, right?
Yeah,
I just think, you know, if we include one another, if we take steps to understand one another at a deep level, that's got to benefit us all, surely.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, for the benefit of anyone listening to this on the audio version, they won't be able to see that you've got this book behind you, but yes, it's a rather stunning looking book. And just remind us what that's called again.
Oh, thank you. Yes, it's called The Little Book of Belonging.
I can make out the word
inclusive habits. Yeah. You can find it on my website, so I'm sure it'll be in the show notes.
Yeah, yeah, no, indeed. So let's get a little bit of your story then, Jackie, because I'm intrigued to know what's led you to where you are now. On the DEI front, I mean, I'm really intrigued to hear more about that as well, as I've been involved in some of that for the automotive industry. And I've got a bit of a strong belief, and I hope that this sort of sits well with you, that actually we know we're achieving a DEI workplace when we don't have to talk about it anymore.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? When we've finally got to a place where people are just accepting that there's another human being that just happens to be a little bit different to me.
Yeah, quite. Yeah. I mean, you know, I guess, how did my journey evolve? Well, professionally, I was in recruitment for 15 years as a recruitment consultant, and then I moved into learning and development in the last few years of that, specifically within management development. For the last 10 years, almost, I've been running my own consultancy business. I've already told you about what I do in that. And I I actually am quite a believer that our lives evolve anyway, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so often, without sounding too sort of cheesy about the whole thing, I think often we find ourselves in exactly where we need to be at that given moment in time,
Mm.
and almost everything that's gone before comes together to make it right, make it feel congruent to what we are doing and who we have become right here and now.
That makes sense.
So,
Yeah, I get that.
yeah. So of course I had my recruitment background, then learning and development, then went into run my own business. And it was about 4.5 years ago now, either the very end of 2017 or the very beginning of 2018, I joined the Professional Speaking Association. Somebody had said to me, look, you do a lot around the training work, you're always speaking to audiences, why don't you sort of check this organization out? And I went along, and it immediately felt very welcome and a part of something bigger than myself, which can be pretty helpful when you work alone, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And long story short, to be honest, but I started telling my own story, my own personal story. So I'm gay. I came out of the closet. Well, it's sort of dragged out of me, but that's another story. When I was 15, I remained actually quite heavily in the closet in much of my working career, just for fear of having the bullying I received in my teens repeated in my adult life. So I started telling that story. There's obviously more to it than that, but I started telling that story at the Professional Speaking Association. So I kind of joined and came out of the closet to my fellow speaking community quite early on in having joined the PSA. And I think, the older you get, it becomes a little bit, I'm a bit too long in the tooth. I am who I am, and, my life is for living, and I'm not hurting anyone and whatever. So, but it was well received. People understood, took time to listen. And then from there, I had the opportunity to do a TEDx talk, and it was quite local to me. I live in Shropshire in England, and this TED Talk was in Telford, which was only about 40 minutes from where I live.
That's just up the road, isn't it? Yeah,
just up the road, basically. Yeah. So, so I went along and did that. And that
for anyone outside of England, by the way, Telford is actually probably one of the most difficult places to get to in the country. Who doesn't live near Telford?
Well, there you go. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you're probably right. Actually, yeah. Not great road networks, but anyway. So I did this TEDx, which was then, I think it went sort of public from recording and then actually published on YouTube in around October 2018. And it was almost like that TEDx talk had become a bit of a business card. And it was never my intention, by the way. You don't do a TEDx talk to promote your business. You do a TEDx talk to promote an idea, right? But people started seeing it, started watching it from all over the world, and basically getting in touch with me saying, hey, you talk on this stuff. Can you help us with this? 2018 was the time where, yes, the diversity, equity and inclusion world was sort of ticking along nicely, but arguably with more to do. So I was brought in to consult to start doing training delivery in that area, build it into leadership development. So it naturally morphed to what I was doing anyway. And then, of course, we had the pandemic, and more specifically, I suppose, in terms of the DE&I space, we had the highly publicized murder of George Floyd in May 2020, which just fundamentally meant that DEI stuff went off the scale. And I mean, it's not a nice way for your business to grow and expand, is it? On the back of something like that. Obviously, I was already in the space. I think there's a lot of people sort of jumped on the bandwagon on the back of it, but certainly I was already in that space and creating a name for myself in that space. And so work has continued. I have my own lived experience, but I certainly don't have everyone's lived experience. And I think that's the important thing in this work. So love what I do, work with lots of people around the world. And it's really varied, and it gives me a chance to kind of very much live authentically and express that in my work as well. So that's
Yeah.
a convoluted story of who I am and what I do and where I come from.
So if it's okay, Jackie, can I take you back to the point that you made about coming out and some stuff that I'm sort of interested in, because, you know, you said you've listened and heard about my story. So, you know, that, you know, we're in a sort of similar place, although at different stages, if you like.
Yeah.
Now, you know, you are clearly considerably younger than me, and I'm and
just
I'm
good
thinking,
filters on here, Steve.
oh, is that what it is? Well, they're bloody good filters. If that's the case, I want some of them. And I'm just intrigued that you said, you know, you came out at 15. You were still worried about there being bullying and that going on into your adult life.
Yeah.
And I'm also as well. You know, I'll take your advice on this, but I'm also now becoming hypersensitive to the phrase coming out of the closet and openly gay and all of that, because I think, you know, if we're to achieve DEI, why are we still using phraseology like that? We don't, you know, people don't sit down with their parents and go, oh, by the way, something I need to tell you, I'm straight.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you see what I'm going? You know,
I do. It's the age-old, you know, debate and discussion, isn't it? Yeah, yeah, that we shouldn't have to be having these conversations, but invariably we do.
So what was the fear of what was the fear of coming out for you then? What was that made up of? I mean, you're clearly in a good place now, and I don't want to trigger any
no,
memories,
not at all. I speak about this publicly, so yeah, anything that could be triggered is well sort of worked through it for sure. But let's just say I'll take you back to 1980. You know, you'll work out if I am considerably younger than you. 1986 ish, 1987, and I was 15. There we are, big giveaway to your audience. And
let me do the math.
I'll be 50 this year, but yeah, so I knew I was different. If I take you a bit further back, actually, and I don't want to sort of waffle on too much about it, but when I was 5, I had a lazy eye, if you like. So I had my left eye turned inward a little bit, and I looked from other kids, and they picked on me, they noticed, called me names, all the rest of it. You know, the things that little kids do. You know, I was like 5 years old, and they were all similar age. It wasn't very nice, obviously, but it was temporary. It was a temporary disability, I suppose. You know, my parents took me off and it was corrected and so on. So I'd been aware of bullying at a very young age. And so when I then, be told, I probably really knew from 12, 13, whatever. But when I really finally worked through my own mind and decided to tell someone, which happened to be a couple of friends at school, I was certainly acutely worried about the bullying happening again. And unfortunately, it did. So my friends themselves weren't too bad, but of course they talked. You know, that's what teenagers do, and they talked, and so that bullying happened again. I was kind of, dare I say, you know, without being too light about it, but kind of the only gay in the village, or certainly the only gay in the school, as it were. And I went to a Catholic school, which just added another, I guess, layer of complexity. And we were in the 80s, and my mum, very strict Catholic. My dad, very typical of the generation, if you like. You know, he used to have things like mind your language and really inappropriate stuff on the TV that was very blatantly excluding people that were different. And so I decided I wouldn't tell them, and they'd never know, and all these kind of things. And basically they noticed, not that you don't notice somebody's gay, but you notice a change in behavior. Of course, I'm sure in the work that you do and the support that you give through your Menable work, Stephen, you recognize this. So, you know, if we're feeling anxious, I'm not a mental health expert, by the way, so please don't quote me on that per se, but you know, what I do recognize from my own experiences, you know, when we're scared, when we're anxious, when we're worried, you know, that manifests itself in different ways. And right, it might be that we withdraw a little, and I withdrew a little. I was highly extroverted and withdrew quite a lot. And also just my behavior, really. I mean, all right, I was a teenager anyway, which of course has its own behaviors that manifest, hormones and so on, but also there was that fear. So I think I was, those teenage behaviors probably were exacerbated a little bit in whatever that might have looked like. But fundamentally, they noticed something wasn't quite right and they challenged me on it. And I won't bore you the whole story, because people can find it in my keynotes and things like that. But essentially, it was kind of dragged out of me. My dad was kind of guessing what it was, asked me if I was pregnant, on drugs, being abused. You know, there were some real serious things that he was challenging me on. And when he finally kind of guessed what it was, I'm not going to say it was in a way a relief for him, because I don't think that was it. But the fact, or the way that he chose the response, which basically was to give me a big hug and say, "Is that all?" Now, bear in mind, you know, I was in floods of tears, thought I was about to lose my parents and my home and get kicked out and all those things. That was pretty amazing, you know. And what I will share is that I often say in my keynotes that, you know, that day he chose love. And I'm saying him, by the way, because...
Sorry, say that again, Jackie. That day
he chose love.
Wow.
You know, and he could, you know, when we hear something that challenges our own status quo, our own map of the world, you know, for anyone watching this, I've got a big map of the world behind me, and that's kind of it's really metaphorical for, you know, we all have our experiences and our identities and our beliefs and our values, and they form that unique map. So when we come into contact with people that have a very different map to our own, we have a choice. So we can turn away from that person and decide, well, they're not like me, and therefore there must be something quote unquote wrong with them. Or we turn in and we choose love as a start point, right? So we choose that as a start point, and then we seek to understand, and we do the work to understand. So, and yes, I mean, my mum, by the way, was also okay in time, but, you know, she was in another room, which is why I'm referring to my dad here. So it was quite a journey. And, you know, yeah, he said, "Is that all?" and gave me this big hug, which was lovely. And, you know, there was a lot of work to do as a family. And obviously I was a teenager as well. And, you know, there was the whole thing about my mum thinking might be a phase and all those kind of things. And I remember distinctly saying to her, "It might be, Mum, but I won't know until I come out of it." And I think it's probably fair to say I'm not going to come out of that now.
Yeah, you might.
Given we're 35 years later and I'm married and all the rest of it. So yeah.
Yeah. Can you pinpoint a time or a point in that journey over those years where your parents accepted? Because I mean, the reason I say that is because I did a podcast recently with Martin Ferber, who's had a very similar story, and he talked about how his mum took the news and things that she said, and it was very evident that she didn't accept, she tolerated, and that there's a difference, isn't there?
Yeah, I suppose there is, really. And it's a really interesting question, because I'm not sure I can pinpoint. I think it was, you know, everybody's journey, whatever we're going through, will be a different one, right? That takes us back to the unique map of the world we all have. For me, I think it's been a very slow evolutionary journey. You know, that I have no idea, and I'll probably never know, perhaps the conversations that they might have had. Maybe they cried tears over it. I don't know. You know, they were never sort of the parents that, you know, oh, you know, get married so we get grandkids and all that kind of thing. They were never, thankfully, not too worried about that. So that was a slight bonus. But you know, I didn't get any pressure of that nature, if that makes sense. But nevertheless, I think, you know, I have no doubt that my mum must have gone through a big inner journey with her Catholic beliefs and the love she has for me. I've no doubt about that. And, you know, it quite possibly will have caused, I don't know, been the cause of concern and anxiety and worry. And, again, we are going back to the 80s here. So if you think about it, what was going on really in the kind of gay world was the AIDS pandemic, right? HIV and AIDS, which was, of course, associated heavily with gay men rather than lesbians. But notwithstanding, when these things go on, they become massive taboos to entire communities. And so, the whole world was very, very different back then.
Yeah.
So I can't really answer that question categorically and say, oh yeah, this day this happened, and even, my wife and I have been married now just over 5 years. In fact, we celebrated our 5th anniversary just last week, and we're in June. And we didn't purposely get married in Pride Month, by the way. It just happened that way.
Well, why not?
Yeah, well, absolutely. Just was what we worked out. But and they came to the wedding. But I know that even that whole experience was an unusual one for them, right? And it was a wonderful experience. All our families came, and it was lovely.
But the overriding thing that I took from what you've just described there was when you said that, and that's why I asked you to say it twice, because when you said your dad chose love. And, I can understand, and that did bring a lump to it, did it again just then, but, and because I think as a parent myself, I understand how, naturally everything is driven by love. It's just an instinct and an intuition. You just do it. But if that comes up full frontal against your values and beliefs and education and upbringing and all of that does give you a dilemma. So
absolutely. And when you think about it, even as I'm talking now, we can perhaps, well, I certainly can think back to what it was like in the 80s, and the things I used to watch on TV, the things that the language people used to use around lots of elements of diversity, not just in the LGBTQ world, and how that has shifted and changed. But when you kind of, if I think back to how my parents were raised as well, so I often say in organizations, we copy what we see every day. That's what creates culture. It's what creates societal norms. We copy what we see every day. It's what creates the adults our children become. The behaviors that are demonstrated and the language that is used. And so my parents were of a generation where, they saw very different things. And then I learned very different things through them. And then, people of my age who are parents, their children will learn different things as well, or caregivers, of course. So, it's that whole kind of understanding the map, and also having a compassion for people who have a defined map that's very, very different to the one you hold yourself. Because that's when you say it brought a lump to your throat when I said, my dad chose love. But the reason I think it's so powerful is not just because, oh, isn't that a lovely reaction from your father, which of course is wonderful and still gets me actually to this day. But it's also when you consider how different those maps of the world are, the values, the belief systems, the experiences, the identity, the differences. It's almost like you have this massive pattern interrupt, right? Where you're coming into contact with somebody that you thought you knew, perhaps, right? Who then is throwing something out and you're like, oh, okay. And I'm sure you understand this, right?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. I mean, it's you can see the internal battles that people have. I mean, it's, thinking back to your map analogy and looking at the map that's on your wall there. I mean, it's almost back to the sort of flat earther kind of thing, isn't it? That you can imagine how Christopher Columbus must have felt when everyone said, don't go too far, you're going to fall off the edge.
Fall off. Yeah.
It's a daft analogy, I know, but it's a similar kind of thing, isn't it? Is that you're right. We kind of judge the world based on what we believe and what we've been brought up to believe. And then somebody comes along and pushes the boundaries. my version of that, of course, was that I was in a masculine environment, the automotive industry, and
Yeah.
that was a breeding ground for all the comments, the jokes, the jibes, and I was party to that, and all the time. That's why I never felt authentic, because I was joking and joining in
Just
the
sort of go along
banter.
with it, don't you? Yeah.
Yeah, going along with all the banter, and we are at a similar age. I am older than you, but a similar age, and then so you must be familiar with that as well. And at the same time, having your own internal battle, thinking, oh, if only they knew.
Yeah. And funnily enough, I mean, I know you asked me, or you alluded to, the journey of, when I mentioned that, yes, I came out of the closet at 15 to my parents, and yes, some of my school friends knew, but I absolutely was not out of the closet in the workplace, in the main, for my 20s or 30s. In the main.
Okay.
In the main.
Yeah.
And so.
And that would have been what, in the 90s, and then the early
90s, is it?
Yeah.
And the reason for that, and I think this is a really important one for perhaps people listening, is that the experiences that you have in your life that are particularly powerful, whether that's good or bad powerful, shape your ongoing behavior and action, right? And so the fact that I had not just been bullied as a 5-year-old, but I was also then bullied as a 15-year-old. And yes, it doesn't matter how many people say, well, come on, they were just kids. Kids can be cruel. It doesn't matter, because those triggers stay with you.
Yeah.
And so, I don't have kind of distinct memories from all the little jobs I had, but I do know. So, for example, in my early 20s, I was a holiday rep, right? So going back to reasonably extroverted personality. So I was a holiday rep for 4 years, right? Hard work. And it was very much a culture of work hard, play hard, right? And I tell you what, it was really hard as a early 20s girl, lesbian, right? Out in, and it's probably not particularly PC, but the world of Straitsville, as I would perhaps call it.
Yeah.
So the girls were, and this is a very generalist comment, by the way, but the girls I worked with, they loved the men, and we worked a lot in Cyprus. So you got a lot of army guys, on site there in the bases, and then and again, not exclusively, but the vast majority of the male reps were gay, right? And of course, the tourists
sounds
loved
like
it.
I missed my vocation there, Jackie.
but the tourists loved the gay men. The camper, the better, right?
Oh yeah,
the more extravagant, the better. Flamboyant, the better.
Yeah.
But there wasn't really a place for the lesbian, right? Where did I sit?
Right.
So I actually had a brilliant time. I was a great seller. I had some wonderful friends, but I was actually very lonely. I was very lonely in those 5 years. Apart from, the odd person that I met on the journey. And, in your early 20s, you normally meet people here, there, and everywhere, right? But not me, because I was quite lonely, because I was hiding a big part of myself, and continued because it was fundamentally my protection mechanism in the workplace.
Right.
Became very focused on when I then literally, it felt like literally got off a plane from repping, walked into a recruitment agency and said, hey, I can sell and I'm good with people, got any jobs? And they offered me a job as a recruitment consultant. 15 years later, that's what I was doing. It wasn't until, funnily enough, I met my now wife, which is 15 years ago. So I would have been sort of mid to late 30s, if you like, that I decided I was now okay and settled enough to come out of the closet.
Yeah.
And I'd already made a name for myself in the corporate world by that point as well. So there was no worry about being overlooked for promotion that might have existed before, or been treated differently or whatever.
Yeah.
But like you, I had to endure the banter and the comments and the slightly inappropriate language that was used, and just laugh it off and never really get involved with what I'd done at the weekend, and all that kind of stuff.
And ironically, while you were describing that story, in particular your experience as a holiday rep, I'm thinking to myself, there was probably groups of girls that in amongst them were girls that were at the very least curious about their sexuality, if not actually know about their sex, but because they were with a group of girls on holiday, you know, probably the equivalent to a group of guys, you know, there's no way were they gonna, you know, like as you said, a lot of those guys in the army that, you know, were probably actually gay, but it's only been okay to be gay in the army for what, 15 years or so. So
yeah, the world was, I mean, even, you know, even back then it was a very different place. The world's evolved at an extreme rate, really. And much of that is good. Some of it's not so good, but, you know, change is inevitable, isn't it? You know, and hopefully, generally, we'll have positive change as we evolve.
So I can see now how you are sought after a DEI specialist, and you know your story really lends itself to you being a specialist in this area. So what do you see when you go into organizations now? Are we getting there? Are we still, you know, are there still some of these issues? You know, and obviously I know you're not going to talk about any of your specific clients, but you know, what's your experiences as you go out there now and help organizations with this subject?
Yeah. There's still a lot of naivety.
Right.
I think, you know, you've got and again, I'm very much generalizing, of course, but you've got, first of all, you'll have global differences. You know, if I'm working with predominantly US clients, you know, the not to suggest issue around race is not taken seriously in this country. It is. When you go to the US, that's very, very different in terms of, you know, cultural heritage and so on. So, you know, there are bigger focuses, and obviously, you know, the case of George Floyd and other high profile cases occurred over there. Obviously, we've kind of had Stephen Lawrence and other racially motivated attacks in this country too. But, you know, that's a big part of it. Sometimes I think organizations either I mean, this is a common one. We just don't know where to start. It seems like such a mammoth mountain to climb. Where do we start? It might be, we've tried X, Y, Z, but it just doesn't seem to have that sticking, you know, power. It's just a bit of a kind of one-time intervention, and we don't understand why it's not working. Well, of course, you know, any learning intervention that you just like duck in, train, clear off again, that's not going to work, right? So this is no different. You'll get some people where the budgets are tight and so on, and so it is that often gets pushed by the wayside. It's almost not prioritized. That's the thing. But I think I'm referring a lot to, it sounds quite negative here, but there's a lot of intention. There's a lot of positive intention. It is fair to say that some of those companies are probably doing it because they know they've kind of got to now, because they're going to be really obviously a lagger if they don't. But I do think there are a lot of organizations that want to do it. The intention is there, and they just need maybe some support in terms of bringing it together, in terms of a kind of full-on, well-rounded, sustainable model for their organization. It's very varied.
In the automotive industry, we've had the DEI work task force, I should say, that was run by the Institute of the Motor Industry, which is the industry's professional body.
Right.
And one of the things that came out in the report that they did was that we have a legacy, an ongoing legacy of something that they called homophily, which is recruiting in your own likeness.
Yeah. It's happened.
And so well, I was going to say, does that happen in other industries as well? And you know, what absolutely would be your tips for a sector like the automotive industry, where actually that's going to take some time for that to wash itself through? Because as a result of that, you know, you can walk into any automotive business and there are a lot of people who look very similar and act very similar. Is that going to be a welcoming place for, you know, gay people, you know, people from ethnic minorities, people with disabilities, you know, and that was the whole point of the task force, really. So
yeah, and this is where a lot of organizations sit, right? They've got very homogenous teams, very homogenous leadership teams, and you know, senior teams, which makes things difficult. So you what you're describing is like an affinity bias, really, which is a type of unconscious bias. We gravitate to people like us, right? We all do it. It's human nature. So this is why some of your listeners might have heard about, maybe they've even been on unconscious bias training, and which gets a tough rap, right? So where people go, unconscious bias training is rubbish and it doesn't work, and and I would agree with it doesn't work as long as you add on in isolation. You can't go on like I've said already about isolated training, but you can't go on an unconscious bias course, learn that we all have biases, and actually just go for that. Now you're aware of it, it'll be fine, because it doesn't work like that. What organizations need to do, and so this is a tip for anyone listening, is to basically look at the processes. We are too fallible, I guess, as human beings, that we would say, yeah, I can look beyond it, I don't have bias, and you know, I'm doing the work. But that simply isn't going to be enough, right? So an organization needs to look at its processes and think about, okay, what questions are we asking? What are the measures that we're using to decide whether somebody's right or wrong? When we advertise for skills, why do we need those skills and qualifications? Is that because that's what we've always asked for and always looked for? Or is that because it's critical to that role? Who's on the interviewing panel? You know, if we don't have a diverse panel of people that we can get in an interview room, then can we partner with an external supplier to bring some diversity to the panel, so you're avoiding that group think? You know, if you've got people who are similar to one another, they're going to be looking for similar things to one another. Are we asking the same questions of everybody, and are they fair questions? I would even say, are we advertising in places and in ways that are accessible for everyone? You know, it's so easy, isn't it, just to bang a job on LinkedIn these days?
Even the wording of an advert.
Absolutely, yeah. You know, we're looking for someone dynamic and enthusiastic. It's like, whoa, hang on a minute. We've got to be really careful with the way that language may not be discriminatory, but is that language typically going to attract a certain demographic to apply, and furthermore detract another demographic from applying? So there's far too much to go into all the detail, but that's just some of the elements of tips for your people to consider, for your listeners to consider in their organizations. Is, yes, think about how unconscious bias affects us individually, but moreover, to force us out of making decisions based on our own subjective bias, have to look at the systems and processes that are in place to force us to do that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So just to round that circle off a little bit for me, because I'm conscious that, you know, we are still talking about, and in our industry, the automotive industry is quite homogenous in that way. What could they do? What could leaders in that industry do to prevent going too far the other way, and then sort of going, oh, I don't understand this, so what I'll do is I'll actively, positively discriminate to get more diverse people in? If there's just, you see what I do, that question makes sense, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, of course, don't forget, positive discrimination is also illegal in this country. So there is a difference between positive discrimination and positive action, which again, I'd suggest people read up on, just to get clear on that. But in terms of we also don't want tokenism, right? So that's where I'll go with that, in terms of you certainly don't just want to take the token disabled person, the token black person, etc., etc., etc.
No, exactly. Yeah.
So my thoughts here would be, consider all the different avenues to bring people into your organization. So one example, there is an organization called Even Break, right? I'm on commission with them, but I'll let you know of them anyway, because I think they're brilliant. Even Break, run by a friend of mine, Jane Hatton, who provide career guidance and support and advertising services for organizations, predominantly for people living with disabilities. Right, there are approximately at this time of recording around about 400,000 disabled people who are able, willing, and looking for work in the UK right now. Right. However, not all of those people can read a job advert on LinkedIn or can have access to certain platforms or newspapers or wherever people advertise their jobs. So Even Break is just one of those platforms supporting people of a certain demographic, if you like, specifically to find work. So my thoughts would be is that if your listeners in their organizations can start thinking, and it's hard because you're looking with your own map, your own lens, but start thinking and maybe going externally, partnering with a consultant, a specialist, checking out Jane at Even Break or whoever it might be, to look at, okay, where might other demographics hang out, right? What do they need? Do we have job specs available in video form, in audio form, in Braille? These are just some examples, right? When you start looking and asking yourself maybe a different question, which is, and I'll finish here, Stephen, but where you've got, instead of saying, right, who's going to apply or who can apply, maybe start asking who can't. Who, by us advertising, using this wording, having these requirements, placing it in this location, in this format, who can't apply?
Yeah.
And that just gets you thinking about things in a slightly different way. Yeah. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, that's been really helpful. Thank you. And I'm delighted that you were able to put that all into the context of your story and your journey. And, I've seen you speaking about it on stage, and it was awesome and inspiring. So thank you very much for that. And the work that you're doing is admirable. So, and I hope that there'll be opportunities for us to do something together. Even if it's, when I join the high ranks of PSA royalty.
I'm sure you'll be there. Yeah, absolutely. And it's been a pleasure talking to you. And I have done some work with automotive companies as well, by the way. So I understand certainly from the experience I had, sometimes the mentality of the workforce and the type of work that is involved in automotive. Yes, it is one element of business, but there are many elements. So I don't want your listeners thinking, God, we're the only ones getting it wrong or not doing.
Oh no, far from it. Yeah.
Far from it. I mean, there's a lot of people in automotive, as with other areas, that are also doing a lot right as well.
Yeah, so, absolutely right. Yeah, I think we lose sight of that in our industry very quickly because it can be quite reactive. But yeah, you look around and like you and I have the luxury of seeing other industries as well. And when I look back in the industry I'm in love with, I can see that, oh yeah, actually we are doing quite well. So
that's right.
So Jackie, thank you very much. How would people be able to get hold of you if what you've talked about today resonates and they want to get in contact? What's the best way that they can find you?
Sure. Well, Jackie Handy on LinkedIn. You'll see, I think, what am I these days? FPSE, FEREC or something. So yeah, there's a few letters after my name. Special, but so Jackie Handy on LinkedIn, jackiehandy.com, that's the website where you'll find details of the book. You'll see my TEDx is on there, and another keynote that I delivered as well is on there. So yeah, brilliant. That's the best way to reach out to me. See lots of info there.
Brilliant. Jackie, thank you so much indeed. Have you enjoyed being on Menable Matters?
I've really enjoyed it. Yeah, thanks for inviting me on, and kudos to you for creating this platform actually, and the work that you do, because I do. I mean, I'm not a man, but I appreciate that. Mental health and well-being is not a female thing, right? It's a human thing, and so great work for stepping out and doing it, and And I hope that the people listening have taken something from this conversation, but also really importantly, get a lot from the work you do, Stephen. So,
oh, Jackie, thank you. That's really kind of you. Thank you so much. I've got that lump back in my throat again. Bless you.
No,
Okay.
I mean it though. It's important work.
Yeah, no, thank you. Well, I hope to see you at some point at a future PSA meeting. And but obviously we'll keep in touch as well. But in the meantime, thank you so much indeed. And we'll catch up soon.
Thank you, Stephen.